change has to happen at all levels, and it starts in the deepest parts of each of us, but it culminates in changes to the global systems that surround us. And that leads us, I think, quite appropriately into our next conversation, which is looking at the big picture. How can we solve our global collective action problem? And we need to look at this from two ways, both in looking at individual manifestations where there's a global challenge that we can't quite solve, pandemics, public health, climate change, global systemic poverty and inequality, and many, many others. We also need to recognize that our world is not yet sufficiently organized to solve this entire category of problems. I can think of no better people to discuss this challenge than the people who I'm happy to introduce now. First, David Miliband, the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee and the former UK Foreign Minister. Kevin Rudd, the President of the Asia Society and the former Australian Prime Minister, in conversation with Gillian Tett, the editor-at-large of the Financial Times.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jamie. It's great to be here. And having heard some very inspiring words about the need for global cooperation in a world where we're all exposed to each other, we're now going to ask whether we have a governance system which is remotely suited for this. I imagine the answer can be probably summed up in one word pretty quickly, but we want to explain how and why. And as you've heard, I've got David Miliband, someone who was previously Foreign Secretary and is now grappling with the refugee problem, and Kevin Rudd, who was previously Australian Prime Minister and is an expert on Asian affairs, particularly China, US, Asia, Australia affairs. So let me start with you, David. How bad is a refugee problem today? I mean, it's one of the symbols of being a connected world. And do we have anything like the governance structures to deal with it that we need? And if not, if you were suddenly put in charge of the entire world with a magic wand, what exactly would you do?
Thanks, Gillian. Great to be here with you and Kevin. The easy part of the question is how bad is the problem? We know there are 82 million people displaced by conflict and violence around the world. These are not economic migrants. They're displaced because of a failure of politics. About 35 million of them cross borders, so they become refugees. Another 45 million of them are internally displaced within their own countries. Most of them are in poor countries, not in rich countries, 85 or 86% of them in poor or lower middle income countries. So the issue, the responsibility of hosting refugees is disproportionately borne by the poorest parts of the world, even if the media coverage would present crisis in America or in Europe as being the center of the global refugee issue. The governance problem is fundamental in policy and in politics. The policy problem is that the roots of the refugee crisis lie in conflicts that are being exacerbated rather than resolved. These are civil wars, of which there are many times more than during the Cold War, interestingly enough. The tools of diplomacy that were developed after the Second World War are not adequate to the civil wars that exist today. And then the treatment of the symptoms is a splintered and fractured system where many people don't get any help at all and too many people get only partial help. Just to skip to what do we do about it, there are two paths, one of which I don't recommend, which is new international treaties, an attempt at a new multilateral compact. I think that the essence of the discussions today come down to this point. Big change happens when there is government leadership, business and NGO innovation, and mass mobilization. But the critical point is they don't have to happen in that order. Kevin and I have both been in government, and the truth about the modern world is that governments are running away from big problems rather than addressing them. And so instead of waiting for government leadership, I think we need business and NGO innovation, and we need mass mobilization. And the governments are going to have to be dragged towards the solutions rather than leading the way towards them.
Right. Well, mass mobilization is one of the things that this organization is very much aiming to try and deliver. Kevin, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think that initiatives like One Shared World can create the kind of mass mobilization we need? Can these issues come from the private sector, or do we need to shake up the whole world order and create sort of new structures as well?
Thanks, Gillian. It's good to be with you and with David and One Shared World. The bottom line is we should not waste 1 minute of our time redesigning structures. This is like an exercise in Thomist theology in trying to reconstruct.
Then you might have to explain Thomist theology for the wider audience. Okay, we're not all as brainiac as you.
No, as in Thomas Aquinas, which is creating this perfect order and castles in the air. In Australia, we just describe all that as bull dust. The truth is, the structures prior to 1945 didn't exist. After 1945, they do exist, however imperfect they are. What is missing is two sets of qualities. One is the galvanizing power of a good and driving idea. And the second is a group of leaders from states, large or small, to turn the idea in reality, driving it through the existing institutions of global governance. And my final point would be, Gillian, is that, as David has correctly identified, governments in this third decade of the 21st century are notoriously risk averse, perhaps not through lack of courage, it's simply because of the nature of the fragmented natures of their own internal democracies and political systems. Therefore, David's core point about business leadership and civil society comes to the fore. If you do not have a global group, however small, handful of committed national leaders who are prepared to combine their political capital and drive a particular reform around a galvanizing idea through the machinery of global governance, then that's where civil society does need to step in and create, as it were, the momentum from below. It is therefore this cocktail of the idea, the group of political leaders, only a handful to make things happen, and then thirdly, in the absence of that, or perhaps in the presence of it, an underpinning societal movement, which actually gives it the juice and the energy and frankly the drive to move the dial over time.
Well, that's obviously what One Shared World is seeking to contribute to. But I'm curious, the structures set up after World War II that you referred to, Kevin, were essentially set up by the Western allies. Places like China were an afterthought. I think Australia was noticed, but China wasn't part of the G7, wasn't part of the Bretton Woods, wasn't part of these groups. Of course, in the subsequent decades, it has become much more involved. But do you think they're really fit for purpose, given the Western slant today, Kevin?
Well, where I partly disagree with you is that the Republic of China actually was a negotiator of both Bretton Woods and at the San Francisco Conference. After the civil war in China in 1949, the Communist Party took over, and of course you then had a period of protracted absence of China from the table. But the broader point you make, Gillian, is absolutely right. That is, there were 50 nation states gathered together in San Francisco. Now there are 192 around the table of the General Assembly in New York. However, each of them have separately acceded to membership of the institution. The UN Charter itself, and even the International Covenant on Human Rights of 1948, these were drafted by, frankly, widely representative panels. The 48 Declaration was drafted not just by Eleanor Roosevelt, but by senior Chinese officials, senior Indian officials, and others as well. But the critical point of legitimacy is that the ensuing 142 member states all put their hand up to join this institution. And if you look carefully at the founding documents, they are not particularly, in my view, slanted towards a particular worldview. And therefore, I go back to my original point. These founding documents, we should thank all of our predecessors for having exerted blood, sweat and tears to bring them into being in the first place. And the institutions on which they're based are not perfect. They're not ideal reincarnations of the kingdom of heaven on earth, but they're workable, they're usable, they exist in a manner which nothing really existed prior to 1939, apart from the shambolic structures of the League. And prior to 1914, nothing existed at all. So the question becomes one again of the power of the idea. 4 or 5 heads of government, whoever they may be, to make things work in the system, who take it as part of their national mission statement to drive the multilateral system towards producing results. And David and I have seen where that's happened and where it's failed. And thirdly, to reinforce that with a community movement which gives it political energy and momentum on the ground.
David, I can see you nodding enthusiastically. I'd be interested to hear your comments on that. But also I'd like to ask you something else. You know, we have this body called the United Nations, which presumes that the nation state is the main functioning unit of governance. And yet we're living today in a world where nation states are often fracturing, often ineffective. And in many cases, you know, refugee problems are not about nation state, they're about local and other institutions. Do you think we need to widen our definition beyond the nation state?
I was nodding because I think Kevin's making a really important point. The 1945 settlement, 2 very important points. The 1945 settlement, for the first time in human history, put the rights of individuals alongside the rights of states in international law and international norms. That was very, very important. And it's vital that we don't think we have to rewrite the laws and norms. We have to live up to the ones that exist. The second reason I was nodding is that he knows so much more about China than I do, but I do know there's a vigorous attempt among the current Chinese leadership to claim their share of the credit for the post-1945 settlement. And I think Rana Mitter has written a brilliant book about this recently, and from Oxford. And so this idea that somehow the 1945 settlement was this Western imposition, the truth is capitalist and communist, democratic countries and dictatorships all signed up to a set of commitments to individuals. But those commitments are not being met. There's never been a golden age. I don't look back to the Cold War as a golden age. But there was a moment in the early 2000s when the notion that an interdependent world had to take seriously communal responsibility was gaining ground. Over the last 15 years, that's been in headlong retreat. And that's the burden of the second part of your question. I think that there is a real importance in recognizing that the multilateral system, the global governance system, can't just be a multinational system. It can't be such, and a multinational system is one by definition that just involves nations. The multilateral system today must involve business and civil society, and it must involve regional and local government. Remember, California would be the 3rd biggest country in the world if it was a country by size of its economy. So the idea that the multilateral system ignores the Californias of this world, never mind the great cities of this world, seems to me to be foolish. And the future is not a simple multilateral grid. It's going to be a lot of overlapping networks. And my emphasis would be on coalitions of the willing. Let's get stuff done. Let's not try and think that 193 countries coming together to rewrite laws and norms is going to get things done.
Right. Well, that is a very inspiring note on which to throw back to Jamie. It really does frame very well the theme of the day. So thank you both very much indeed for that history lesson and that lesson in Thomas Aquinas, which I'm sure everyone has noted. And I hope that we'll be picking it up for the rest of today's discussion. So thank you.